Hello folks, welcome to the Edupedia world and I am Abhinay Gupta. Today again we'll continue with the topic, the appointment and qualification of directors. So far we have already had a couple of lectures on this topic where we have already understood the need of a director, what is a director, we have seen the procedures for its appointment, its qualification, its disqualification, we have seen the entire procedure of allotment and application for DEN. Right, we have undergone the section and also the rules that support those sections, right? So we have gone into details about them. Then we have already seen section 160, 166, 160 and the rest of them. We have seen the difference between an executive and a non-executive director. So we have already covered a couple of basic concepts about directorship, right? We have seen the limit of directorship, the limit of number of directors in a company, right? And how to deal with it, how to extend it, right, what curbs it, the role of article in them, the role of government. All of these topics have already been covered in your previous lectures, right? So what are we gonna touch today? Today we'll move on to a little typical topic, right? One topic which as a student was very difficult for me to understand, right? That never went through my head. That is the concept of proportional representation, right? What is proportional representation? How do we make proportional representation? What is the use of proportional representation, right? And we'll also see the provisions related to the woman director and a resident director. So that will be our topic of the day. So let us start with it. So the first thing is the proportional representation, which is covered under section 163. So the first basic concept that we need to understand when we are talking about proportional representation is that what do we actually mean by proportional representation and why do we need it? So consider any scenario, any election scenario. Consider a scenario of election in your general meeting for appointment of directors, or even a general election in the city for any city council, mayor, anything, any kind of election, right? Whenever you talk about election, you talk about any kind of election, and proportional representation is not just a concept contained in the Companies Act 2013, but it is a very general and wide concept, right? And it is being used for election into the parliament and into the government of many countries these days, right? So this is an important topic to understand, right? So when we talk about proportional representation, the word proportional, right, is that does actually play a very important role. Generally, when we are talking about appointment of directors, a simple majority is required to appoint a director in a company. Right? If there is an election of director, if there is a director against whom or in favor of whom, you have to cast a vote. Right? If there is a session for appointment of director and you have an option to cast a vote, you either cast yes or no. Right? And if that director gets a majority, the director becomes that person becomes a director of the company. But if it loses, it does not. Same happens with reappointment and everything. So if we notice a typical thing over here, then what we understand is if there is a majority of shareholder, right, on one hand, they can always rule the appointment pattern, right? So if they are working in a flow, so whichever director they want to elect, they can because they have the majority. And if they vote against a director, the director won't be elected again because it loses the majority. So what do you think? Doesn't the minority, a substantial minority, have a stand? Don't they have any right? Right? So this can be an incidence of oppression and mismanagement, right? Where the weak, where the minority is not being able to exercise their right. That is when the proportional representation steps in. It is a procedure for election, right? Whereby both the minority and the majority get a fair stand to elect their candidate, to elect the candidate of their own choice. So it basically enables the minority of definitely a respectable strength to elect their representative, and at the same time it does not take away the right from the majority shareholder. They also have their voting strength as per the proportion of the vote they have, right? But the minority also get a stand. Okay? How does that happen? We'll understand that. We'll understand the procedure of proportional representation when we talk about the various types of proportional representation later in the lecture, right? So now we'll understand the basic provisions of the law given in the Companies Act regarding proportional representation, and then we will go on to understand how proportional representation takes place. So before that, we'll understand the circumstances that lead to the proportional representation. When does an election by proportional representation take place? The first major requirement for that is the authorization by the Article of Association of the company. So if you intend to make a proportional representation, first of all you will have to check and confirm with your Article of Association whether there is any provision, right? Whether the article provides for proportional representation, right? So the basic requirement is that the article should have specific provision for election of a director by proportional representation, right? And it will also prescribe the detailed procedure of how the proportional representation is to be taken place. How will it be conducted, right? Whether it will be through a cumulative voting, whether it will be by single transferable vote method, or whatever other method that can be used, right? Article will provide for the procedure. But suppose if there is nothing contained in an article, but still the minority wants a proportional representation. There is a situation of oppression of the minority. So do they have a remedy for that? Do they have a way out? The answer is yes. The proportional representation can be compulsorily adopted, right? How can that be done? That eligible member, the minority, the substantial minority, will have to give an application to the company law board, right? Either they can give an application to the company law board, or even the central government can reference to the company law board for allowing the proportional representation, right? Then what will the central law board, the company law board do? The company law board would set an inquiry, right? And then it will decide whether or not the proportional representation should be allowed, whether or not there is a case of oppression. So in case of central government, they may pass an order for the central government. They may allow them to appoint a nominee director into the board of the company. And in the case of the petition or the application made by the shareholders, the minority substantial shareholders of the company, then the company law board would direct those shareholders to appoint the director by the means of proportional representation. And once the company law board gives those direction to the company would be bound to make the proportional representation. And for that they will have to first go ahead and amend their Article of Association. They will have to insert the provision, the specific provision of appointment of directors by proportional representation into their article, right? And then they'll make a fresh appointment of the directors, and that will be done by proportional representation, right? And that will also be done within the time limit which the company law board prescribes. If the company law board wants the proportional representation to be conducted in the next 3 months, then it has to be completed in the next 3 months. Like that is an example, right? So if the proportional representation is taken over, then the first thing that the company needs to decide is the mode of voting, right? What mode of voting will they use? Proportional representation means representation made by the proportion, right? And that can be using various mathematical concepts, mathematical procedures, right? It can be done by single transferable vote method, by cumulative voting method, right? Those are specific representation based on certain formulas of mathematics, right? So it is a little complex thing, but yeah, I'll explain it to you in detail and make it clear with you as to what those voting methods are, right? But first we need to understand the other provisions in the section 163. Then first we need to know what are the number of directors who are to be appointed by the mode of proportional representation, right? So whenever a company adopts the method of proportional representation, then they will have to elect not less than 2/3 of the total number of directors by means of proportional representation, right? So nearly 66%, not less than 2/3, not less than that, right? So more than 2/3 of the director has to be elected by the mean of proportional representation, right? And this appointment of director by the mean of proportional representation has to be made once in every 3 years. That is the mandate. If you because over here you are amending your article, either it is already provided in your article of association or you have made an amendment in the article as per the direction of the company law board. In any case, now your article provides for proportional representation. So you will have to abide by the procedures, abide by the method of electing the director once in every 3 years, right? And now if there is now suppose you have elected the directors by means of proportional representation, and then there arises a casual vacancy into the office. Now what do we do then? So if something like that happens, if there is any director who vacates the office, right, or if the office falls vacant by any reason, then the office will be filled up. That means the director will be elected as per the provisions given in the article, if article provides something like that. But if the article does not say, if the article remains silent on that aspect, then the director will be elected by the board itself, right, by the board of the directors. Now, so far we have understood the provisions of section 163, the provisions of proportional representation, right? We have understood that proportional representation has to be contained in your article. If not, you can make an application to the company law board in the case of operation, and if the company law board directs, then you will make an amendment into your article and then appoint a director as per proportional representation. And not less than 2/3 director will be appointed by mean of proportional representation, and this phenomena would be repeated once in every 3 years. Right? And in case of casual vacancy, article will direct you how to go ahead. If article remains silent, then the board of directors would appoint the director. So that is all about the provision. But now we'll get into detail about what are the various modes. Right? So the two basic modes that we have been talking about, and that is very common, will be discussed over here. First is voting by single transferable vote, and second is the cumulative voting. So first we will talk about election by means of the single transferable vote. What does single transferable vote, STV, mean? Right? So take an example. There are 5 candidates, right? A, B, C, D and E. Listen very carefully because I'm not drawing a diagram on the screen, right? It is all that you need to visualize and analyze, right? Try and use your imagination, right? So you have 5 candidates, A, B, C, D and E. Now the shareholders have to be voting for them. Now the election is in progress and the votes have been casted. And as per the result, right, you see that you had around 5,000 shareholders. You have 5,000 votes. And what you decide is that any person, any particular director having more than 600 votes would be elected, right? Or say more than 1,000 votes would be elected, and you have to elect only 3 directors, right? So what do is you, after you have done your election, after the votes have been casted, you calculate the votes, and then you find that vote for the A candidate was 500, for B candidate was 1100, for C candidate was 400, for D it was 800, for E again it was 800. And some of the directors did not cast their vote. Some of the shareholders did not cast their vote. Now what you have seen is that your parameter of 1000 has been qualified by only one director, that is B. Right? So the first director B has already been elected. B will be into your board now. Now is the question of electing the other 2. So what do? Do you go down to D and E who have 800 votes? The answer is no. That is where the simple voting comes into play. The simple voting, according to simple voting, top 3 people would be selected, right? So A having 500 votes and C having 400 votes would have been eliminated. But over here the situation would be different, right? So now what you do is you have 100 votes surplus from the deadline for B, right? B had to have 1000 votes, B has 1100. So 1000 votes will be given to B, 1000 shareholders would be set aside. Yeah, these people have elected B. But that other 100 votes, that is of no use for B. So that would be divided into the other 4 equally, right? So the first one has 525, the third one has 425, both of them have 825, 825 each. Now what you do? After doing this, now does anybody qualify the deadline? The answer is no. So how do you elect the director? Now you see who has the minimum number of votes. That is C. So you cross out C. C is disqualified and the votes lying with C will be distributed. Right? And that would be distributed as per the preference. When you have casted your vote, you have given preference 1, preference 2, preference 3, preference 4. Right? So even the 100 votes that we had talked about will not go equally. That will actually go by preference. So suppose the people who had elected for C as the first candidate, right? Now they have elected the second. For 300 of them was E, and rest 50-50 was divided into A and C. So E shoots up with 300 votes more because second priority is E, because C is cancelled out now. So E with 825 plus 300 crosses 1000. Now E will be selected, and the surplus votes with E would be again distributed among A and D because C is already eliminated, and that will be depending upon the priority number 3 that was given, right? So this is how a single transferable vote procedure goes on, right? I hope it is very clear with you. So in short, now if you understand, then we'll see who has crossed the deadline. So the shareholders, while they are voting, they have a list of 5 directors and they write a number. Yeah, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5 as per their desire, as per their interest. They give the preference, right? So if anybody qualifies the deadline, he is already a director, and if he does not, if some other does not and you still need a director, then the votes would be divided with the second preference. And then if you get all the directors, it is well and good, and if you don't, then the least candidate will be eliminated and his votes will be given to the third preference. So that is how it goes on until you have all the required number of directors into your board. That is STV, single transferable vote. Now if we talk about the cumulative voting system, there what you have is that for example, you have 4 directors A, B, C and D, right? A, B and C are the majority of shareholders, right? You need to elect only 2 directors, and as we have talked about the case that if you have a majority shareholder at one stand and the minority at the other, right? So you have 30% shareholders supporting D, for example. D is their candidate, right? And you have the other 70% and they have already nominated 3 candidates, A, B and C. So if you go by the normal voting system, then they will cast their vote for A and for B and they'll be elected because they have 70% majority. But will that be correct? No, that will result into oppression of the minority. So what you do is, after every director, you'll get a chit again, and in front of the name of all the directors, you get 3 blocks to tick. So select the number 1 priority, number 2 priority, number 3 priority. Right, you fill in the box. So over here what you do is, because it is the concept of cumulative voting, the votes, the 70% vote for candidates A, B and C will be split, because when they are voting they'll give 1 each, or they'll give 2 votes. Every member now will have 3 votes, right? So they'll give 2 votes to A, 1 vote to B, or 2 votes to B, or all the 3 votes to C, whatever be their pattern, right? So their votes will be split into 3 now. But since D is a candidate from that 30%, so there is a chance that all that 30% into 3 votes each, right? If there are 30 votes, it becomes 90, goes to D individually. They'll tick all the 3 boxes for D. All 3 votes from each member goes to D. So D gets a high probability of getting selected, right? So now each shareholder has a weightage of 3, and for the majority, that 3 is divided into 3 candidates. But for the minority, that 3 goes to 1 single person, and hence the chance for the minority director to be elected increases. But at the same time, the chance for the majority does not decrease. They still have their proportion, but since they have a number of candidates in their election, that is a disadvantage and their vote splits, right? So that is how cumulative voting takes place, and this is how STV takes place. So I hope these two modes of voting of proportional representation is clear with you, and now you get to understand how the oppression of the minority is eliminated, right? Or how the substantive minority is given their rights to elect a candidate, right? So that is all about proportional representation. Now I think it is clear with most of the students who have already tried attempting this topic, but this topic went as a bouncer for them, because as a student it went as a bouncer for me too, right? So that is all about section 163, proportional representation. We move on to the next section, that is election of a woman director, right? Appointment of a woman director. Now, is a woman director in a company necessary? So earlier in Companies Act 1956, there was no such mandate. There was no mandate for electing a woman director into the board of directors. But what about Companies Act 2013? Companies Act 2013, as it is a new act, it has come up with some amendments. It has come up with a lot of new things. One among it is the appointment of a woman director as per section 149. Right? So, is it compulsory for all the companies to hold a woman director? The answer is no. Section 149 lays down certain parameters. So, all the companies that pass that parameter, that pass that boundary line, will have to elect a woman director too. They'll have to appoint a woman director. And the companies lying below them, now it's a discretion. If they want to have a woman director, they can. If they don't want to have, they can't. But the companies that are qualifying that deadline will have to have a woman director into their board. So now let us see the provisions of 149 and understand what those parameters are. So first we need to understand that section 149 for appointment of women direction would be read along with the rule 3 of the company's appointment and qualification of director rule 2014. Right? And now what are the basic criterias that we need to understand, right? Or when does a company need to appoint a woman director? Right? We have seen that there is a bandwidth, there is a deadline that the company needs to qualify. So what are they? Right? So all the listed companies, number one, all the listed companies will have to have a woman director into their board. They have no option, right? They will have to have at least one woman director appointed into the board of directors. Apart from them, all the public companies who have the paid up share capital of more than rupees 100 crores, that means a big public company, right, will have to have a woman director. If it is below 100 crores, you may avoid. But once it reaches 100 crore, you cross the boundary, and then in that year you will have to appoint a woman director. And also the public company who has a turnover of rupees 300 crores or more will also have to appoint a woman director into their board of directors. So when you talk about the share capital and the turnover, right? So at what date or when will you check the share capital? So that will always be considered as per your latest audited financial statement. So whatever turnover or share capital you had as on the last date of the latest audited financial statement, based on that parameter you will decide whether or not you fall into the eligibility criteria, right? And if you do, or in the year when you cross the turnover of 300 crore as per your balance sheet, or you cross the capital of 100 crores, right? And that particular year you will have to appoint a woman director, right? And that will have to be done within 6 months, right? So as per the provisions of the Act, any company that comes into incorporation after the enactment of Companies Act 2013, and that company, if it has a capital of greater than 100 crores, it will have to elect a woman director in the coming next 6 months. And if there is an existing company who already have exceeded the parameter, but they did exceed it before the commencement of the Act, and now the Act says that they have to do it, so those company will be given a time of 1 year. So within next 1 year, you will have to appoint a woman director, right? And that is 1 year from the enactment of the Act. That means they will have to appoint a woman director before 31st March 2015, right? Now, what happens? Again, this is all about election of woman director, and that will be done with the general procedure of election of any other director, right? Appointment of any other director. But what if there is a casual vacancy in the office of the woman director? How will that be fulfilled? Right? So if there is a casual vacancy, if there is a vacancy into the office of a woman director, that shall be filled by the board at the earliest possible time. Right? But that time should not be more than either the next board meeting or the period of 3 months from the vacancy, whichever is later. Right? So the minimum time period that you have is 3 months. Right? If you have a board meeting in say next 2 months, right, and it is not possible for you to elect it before that 2 months, then it's all right. You have a parameter of 3 months remaining. So before that 3 months, whichever is later, so before that 3 months, you can elect a woman director. And if you are not able to elect the woman director in 3 months, for example, but you see that the board meeting will be held in next 6 months, so you have the time limit of 6 months there. But you will always have to hurry up, because the act says that you will have to elect a woman director at the earliest that you can. Right? So that is all about woman directors. You just need to know what are the companies, right? What are the parameters? So first is all listed companies. Second is any public company, to be very specific. It is not talking about the private companies. It is talking about the public companies. If the public company has a turnover of greater than 300 crores or a share capital of greater than 100 crores, that public company will have to elect a woman director. Right? So the next topic that we'll be covering is section 149 again, in which we'll talk about the appointment of a resident director. Right? So first we need to understand what do we mean by a resident director. So a resident director is a person, a resident person is a person who has stayed in the country for more than 182 days in the previous calendar year. So mark my words very carefully. We are talking about calendar year, which starts from January and ends in December. So that person has to stay in India for a period of more than 182 days for the previous calendar year. Right? Then we'll consider that person to be resident, and if it is elected as a director, your provision for appointment of a resident director is fulfilled. Right? And which companies? Right. The next is which companies need to appoint a resident director. So unlike the parameters given in woman director, over here all companies, flat provision, all companies will have to have at least one resident director. Right? If that company is in India, you will have to have one resident director. Right? And now we'll look at the legal requirements for electing a resident director. So the requirements are basically dependent on the MCA clarification that was given on this topic via the General Circular number 25 2014 dated 26 June 2014. Right? So that circular was very important, because when you talk about a resident director who has been in the country for the period of more than 182 days in the previous calendar year, right? So when the act was enacted, right, in the year 2014, 1st April 2014, so the company, that is when the provision would be applicable on the companies, right? They'll have to have a resident director. But then, so when the act was applicable on 1/4/2014, so for that particular calendar year, you have just 9 months remaining. That is the period of April to December. So for that calendar year, you would consider proportionate days, that is 136 days instead of 182 days, right? And the companies that are being incorporated in the between the period of 1st April 2014 to 30th September 2014, between that 6 months, those companies will have to abide by these provisions either at the time of incorporation, and if they're not able to comply with this provision at the time of incorporation, they will have a buffer period of 6 months to appoint a resident director, right? But the companies that are incorporated after the 30th of September 2014, they will have to abide by this provision from the very beginning. They don't have a buffer period of 6 months. So when they are incorporated, they will have to have a resident director into their board, right? That is simple. That is the MCA clarification on this topic. Right? So that is all about the resident director. So I think the concept of proportional representation, the requirement of a woman director and a resident director is clear with you. Right? So we'll end the lecture over here today, and we'll continue with the other provisions in the upcoming lectures. So until then, this is Abhinay Gupta signing off. Thank you. Bye-bye.